particular words would be familiar to many of you, and the analogy of wolves in sheep's clothing are motifs and images that you may very well have heard explained before, as to is, of course, those early portions of these verses from 13, 14, 15, 16 and so on that describe this narrow way. But it's important for us perhaps as Christians to be reminded of these kinds of texts, because they have such pertinence to the way in which we consider, especially during this series, the concept of discipleship. The idea of what exactly does it mean to follow Jesus? What does it mean to follow the one who said, I am the way, the truth and the life? Well, indeed, we have here explained for us in no uncertain terms that very concept. And one of the things that will become quite apparent about this passage of text from verses 13 through 20 is that there's nothing particularly complicated about it. Often I enjoy being able to explore some of the syntax and some of the words that are there that have perhaps double entendre or a double meaning. It's a pun, it's a joke, it is highlighting something. But here, these words that have been selected by Christ in this particular passage are rather plain. Of course, it's very heavily dependent upon imagery and upon metaphor, but nevertheless, the actual words that are used and the concepts being communicated are quite straightforward. And when I personally come across texts like these, I tend to take even more note of them, which is sort of ironic, because the simplicity of what is being communicated perhaps demonstrates to us that there is something quite important being said here, that there is something that is of the greatest need to our lives, and therefore it's being communicated in plain, straightforward, and simply unmistakable language. And so let's cast our eyes again to verse 13 and work from there. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Here, in a classic case of Hebrew parallelism, we're being offered two juxtaposing paths, two juxtaposing truths that are not contradictory, but certainly line up thematically with one another. And the contrast is being drawn very clearly and very plainly. We see that there is a narrow gate and a wide one. We see there's a narrow way and a wide way. We see that there are many contrasted to the few. And three significant juxtapositions are given in these opening verses. Some of your translations perhaps may read that the way is easy. It's a good translation, and it certainly communicates the real intent or nature of, or the pragmatic nature of that way that is broad. But certainly the concept in the literal form that's being communicated is that it's broad and it's wide, therefore it's easy, as opposed to this narrow way, which by implication is most difficult. But let us work rather Socratically through these and start at the gate. We see here that there is a gate that is narrow. It is narrow, it is slim to fit through. Perhaps even reminiscent of Christ's words when he is describing that it would be easier for a man to enter through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Perhaps reminiscent of this imagery of difficulty. You have to squeeze to fit through it. It's not simply flung open, it's not simply just waltz on in. And indeed, of course, when we think about the overarching theology of the Gospel of Matthew, of the four Gospels more broadly, of the New Testament and the Scriptures as a whole, we come to understand that the reason why this gate is so narrow is because it is indeed describing the standard of righteousness that is required to actually enter through said gate. There is a standard that is required to be considered a citizen of the kingdom of God. And that standard is perfection. That standard is true righteousness. Oh, how these concepts or this idea of righteousness has been misused in such ways. The concept that one must remain perfect and that one mere slip will send you to the gates of hell. But nevertheless, notice what's not being said here. Namely that the gate is wide, that it's easy to enter through, that no, just simply come on in. And this juxtaposition of ease versus difficulty is what truly undergirds these opening verses. And this is indeed why it is Christ's righteousness that is the one and only way by which we can enter through this gate. Christ himself entered through this gate. Christ himself has walked this way. And we see that the standard of righteousness is what is being held up here as the gatekeeper, so to speak. Hence why one cannot enter into this gate of their own accord, nor can they enter in of their own standard of righteousness or whatever means of justification they may feel that they have. Indeed, human merit, so called by many religions and by many different faiths of the world, is unsatisfactory. And beyond that, simply won't work. You may try and try and try ever so ardently. And so many do. But indeed, those attempts will be futile because the standard simply cannot be met in our own mortal capacity. It is by God's grace and his abounding mercy that we even enter through this gate. And this is, of course, juxtaposed to the easy and the wide way that leads to destruction. We then see, following on from this gate, what? A path, a road, a way. I've read many stories of the operations perhaps that our soldiers have conducted in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And Afghanistan, we often forget, is a very ancient land. And many of the tribes that live in Afghanistan are quite literally thousands of years old. I even had a friend who fought in Uruzgan and up in Kandahar and who reminisced about battles on these near ancient goat trails that wind up through the mountains of Afghanistan. Trails which are literally thousands of years old that have had the feet of average peasant goat herders and all the way to the armies of Alexander the Great walk upon them. And some of these trails are barely a metre wide. And you have a trailing off to a gully or sometimes even just a sheer cliff facing or ravine, and then the mountain slanting up to the other side, and battles being engaged in that context. And of course, obviously, the common denominator has been just how difficult it is to even trek those trails, but more importantly, to fight upon them. For those paths are so narrow, and a misstep this way will result in falling down of the hill. Yet you're blocked on this side by an equally ascending hillside that's so difficult to even come up against. Perhaps it's reminiscent of the kind of motif that's being described here when it's talking about this narrow way. Many different theologians throughout church history have kind of, I suppose, explained or conceptualized whether or not the path is narrow because there are cliff faces going straight up and it's so hard to walk through that way, or whether or not the imagery is kind of conceptualizing a narrow path with a sheer drop off to the side and that one misstep, one or the other, will result in doom. Various different ideas and imagery, but nevertheless both of those encapsulate the kind of imagery that's being portrayed here for us. And the fact that this way is winding, that it is steep, that it is narrow, it's difficult. Because indeed the Christian life is difficult. Now, that particular concept often gets lost on us. And I understand why it gets lost on us contextually. The manner in which Western Christians broadly and as a whole, on average, have been blessed with peace, with safeguard, with luxury, privilege, and so on and so forth. It is unlike that any of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world today experience, and certainly far, far removed from that which our ancestors spiritually experienced. But nevertheless, it, if anything, demands of us an even greater effort to be able to try and conceptualize this fact, to uphold this and to realise this concept, that even in the West, the Christian life is not meant to be easy. Ever more so as we opine so often, that is becoming increasingly the case. And that not only are there moral difficulties, there are intellectual difficulties, practical difficulties, and so on and so forth. Decisions of conscience which come up and which come to the fore, that we must make a decision as to where we stand. Be it small matters within our own family, be it relatively unseemly examples, say in how you run your business, how you honour your employers as an employee, all the way up to how you vote, how you engage in civic life as a citizen of this nation, how you communicate the gospel to those around you, how you demonstrate the effects of the gospel to those around you. And increasingly so, as the decades will continue to go on, we will come to realise to greater and greater extent the true meaning of the fact that this way is narrow and difficult. And that we are called to walk it faithfully, to march and to claw our way upon it. To struggle, not in our own power, but in the power of God in us. So many Christians throughout the ages have seen these words and have not sat dismayed and discouraged that the way is in fact narrow and difficult and arduous, but rather have realised that we do not march this road alone. Indeed, we march a road that Christ himself marched. We march a road where one is despised and rejected, where thousands upon tens of thousands of people flock to him initially, or to have essentially one person by him at the cross, two perhaps even. We see that he was erroneously accused of false teaching, that he was murdered and executed and tortured, that he quite literally marched that road with the cross upon his back, winding up the hill to Golgotha. That example was not for nothing. It was to demonstrate the difficulty in what was being achieved, to demonstrate the lengths to which our God has gone to ensure our salvation, and to demonstrate the fact that God is able, that God is all-powerful, and that if the Spirit of the Lord is with us, then we shall not be overcome by the gates of hell. This road may be difficult and windy and arduous, and may be filled with shortcomings, with struggles, with trial and tribulation. But indeed we do not march that road alone. We march it following the one who has already gone before us, and the one who carries us along the way. Of course, this is contrasted with this broad way that is wide and easy, reminiscent perhaps of the autobahns of Germany, the superhighways that run through Europe. Wide, open, flat, easy going. And there's an ease to it. Because it's easy to live a life of comfort, to live a life of pleasure, to live a life of ease, and to live a life in which you do not have to struggle, to live a life in which you do not have to voice unpopular opinion, to not be challenged intellectually, spiritually, or otherwise. And these days for most Westerners, physically. engage in the bystander effect of standing around and waiting for someone else to do something. It's easy to simply go with the flow, not rock the boat, not cause a fuss, not stand by your conviction. That's easy. It's easy to live a life, not even regarding the very God who gave you said life. But we see indeed this way leads to destruction. Apollyon, it leads to annihilation, it leads to oblivion, it leads to a deep and a dark end. And it says that many are there that go that way, in contrast to the few that enter by the narrow gate and that march upon the narrow way. And ultimately it's this juxtaposition between narrow and few that then informs what then comes afterwards. So we pick up again in verse 15. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. The imagery and the motif of the wolf is familiar even to us, whose national wolf is that of the dingo. But the imagery of wolf was not lost, certainly not anybody in that time, nor anybody across Europe, nor really anybody around the world, save a few places. This concept of wolves is a very appropriate set of imagery here. Because of course the wolf and the sheep are so often contrast. The wolf is a true, pure predator that stalks its prey, that is cunning, that is one of the single most intelligent predators on the earth. It does not rush in wildly and uncontrolled. It does not get inflamed by its emotion, but rather it operates as a team, as a pack. And it will take as long as it needs to strategically deliver that deathly blow. I actually have a friend who works for the US Parks and Wildlife Foundation in the States. The man lives in Colorado. Wolves have already made their way into northern Colorado despite having been removed and expelled from there. And he specialises not just in that, he goes all around North America, Canada, Alaska, dealing with wolf populations. One of the most incredible things about wolves is that they patrol, in many instances, a 300-mile wide territory. In some cases, the Alaskan timber was 500 miles wide. And they claim that as theirs. And anything within that perimeter is theirs. Any deer, any elk, any baby bears, anything else, that is theirs, as far as they're concerned. He was recounting to me a story one time where they were tracking these wolves by GPS, and they noticed that the pack had stopped for quite a while. They'd been stopped in one place for about, by that point I think it was 16 or 18 hours. So they went out to actually check on this wolf population, because they were concerned with the health of one or two of the females. They found the wolf pack, I think in total about 8 of them, sitting in the ice in the dead of winter up on the snowy bank of this river that was trickling down. And in the river was a deer that the wolves had chased rather intentionally into the river, and the deer had gotten its legs stuck in the bedrock. Its head was above water, but most of its body submerged in the icy waters. So instead of the wolves jumping into the icy waters, they had committed themselves strategically to sitting there and waiting for the deer to freeze. And it would be nearly, I think, 30 hours before that deer would properly die. And those wolves waited, and they waited for their moment. Waited for that deer to die, and then they launched their attack. Incredible cunning and strategy. This is what wolves do. They're wily and they lurk in the dark, hide amongst the trees, and plan very strategic. So when we see this kind of imagery being used, talking about the concept of false prophets or false teachers, it shouldn't surprise that this language is being used to say that they disguise themselves as sheep. They go undercover, they use these unconventional tactics, so to speak. And they appear to you like they're one of you. They make themselves look like they're one of the flock. They have their degrees, they've had their tenureships, they've dressed well, they're charismatic, they're very nice, they pray for you all the time, they visit you all the time, they look good. Their teaching is incredible, so passionate, so full of zeal, so inspiring, so moving, they motivate you. Except for the part where they're feeding you half-truths, except for the part where they are extorting people, except for the part where they're abusing people spiritually, sexually, or otherwise. They are wolves by nature, and they are not one of the flock. These wolves that disguise themselves as sheep are everywhere. They have spent even in their own time, decade upon decade, working themselves into eldership boards, working themselves into seminary faculties, working themselves into pastorates. They're on TV, they're on radio, they're on social media, they're on YouTube, they're everywhere. And they sound so convincing. And they've got such big churches that look so full of life. It has so many programs for you to engage in. But inwardly they are deceiving people. Not blatantly, because that simply doesn't work. Majority of people in here can examine what the Quran teaches people, can examine what is the core doctrinal statements of Islam, compare that to what we have, and very clearly see the contrast. If I came up here this morning, greeted you in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, and then began to describe to you why we should all be following Sharia, it would be obvious. And hence why it doesn't work that way. But what does work is giving you 90% of the truth. What works is giving you almost accurate biblical explanation. What works is giving you something so close to the truth that it's difficult to distinguish. Though not impossible, difficult. Hence why the scriptures so often call for us to have discernment, for us to be operating in spirit and in truth, and why the truth is so vital to the Christian life. Because it is only by the standard of truth that we can possibly compare other teachings. One does not know what constitutes a crooked line if one does not know what a straight line is. That is how these ravenous wolves, which by the way is a very interesting adjective to use. Ravenous, of course, describing this ferocity, this gnashing, this desire. Also communicates the idea of lustfulness and of just an unquenchable desire to devour. It's a greed. The events that we've seen in America, for example, as calamitous as they are, and of course, as is the case in most things, more nuanced and complex than whatever you'll read on a 30-second news headline. The state in which that nation, mighty and great amongst all on the earth, the reason why that country largely is in the position that it's in is not because of something that happened 5 minutes ago. The state of a nation does not transform in a day. It develops, or rather more actually devolves, over years and over decades, and in some instances in history over centuries. I believe it's a valid question perhaps to ask, would the United States of America, in this specific example, be in the scenario it's in if so many of its professing churches were not operating the way that they've been operating for decades? If the most watched, viewed and financially supported people in America are the John Osteens, the Creflo Dollars, the Kenneth Copelands, the Joyce Meyers, the Rick Warrens, and so on and so forth. You run the list of the largest mega churches in the United States that have 10, 20, 30, 40,000 people attendance across a week. You will find very few that would ever be deemed by biblical standards to be teaching faithfully and truthfully and properly discipling people. I've been to churches like that in the United States and here. I've been to services where the gospel, and usually it's much more than a moral lesson of some kind as to how God can make your life better and how you can receive a breakthrough and how you can have and claim a better life and a better job and more wealth and so on and so forth. And you have 75% of the congregation throw up their hand in an altar call. Well, they're regular members. And I know for a fact that those same people will throw up their hands when the altar call is made next week or next month or whatever the deal is. And you're being saved almost every month. Because it's so easy to get close to the truth without being the truth itself. And it only takes just a little dilution of that truth to spoil the lot. You know, one of the interesting things about rat poison is that the actual poisonous component is actually very, very small. In some cases, 0.001 micrograms per deciliter, which is a very tiny measurement metric. But that's all the poison that's actually needed to kill the rat. Just a little lie. Well, did God really say that that's what you're to do, Eve? Did God really say? If you worship and honour me, Jesus, I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. Well, that sounds pretty right, because you already own them. But yet there is lie. There's deception. It's a sleight of hand. There's this lurking in the dark, just like the wolves. And wolves present themselves as one of us because they get up here and they look good, they sound great. They've got the music that's slow, melodic, modern day piano chords playing in the back of their sermon. It's so emotional, it's so moving. It seems really good today, guys. The worship was great. Meanwhile, all it's doing is like the piper just leading you away. I wonder where that country would be if that hadn't been the modus operandi all so often in the last 50 years. And we see that happening here. On the same scale? No, because, well, it's not the same population, not the same scale of anything compared to America. We see that happening here. I've been to too many churches that are doing the same things on a small scale. Our church is great because we've got this program and that program, and our worship music is the best, and you should hear the great music we're playing, and gee, Pastor such and such, you know, he's just saying, he's really great, he's so great, you'll love it, it's so inspiring, it's so moving, you know. But are they actually being fed genuine truth? Are they being told the truth? Because what's the point? There is no point. It's why these kind of descriptions are given. And it's why, more importantly, this passage finishes by pointing toward the way that you can actually determine whether these people are real or not, whether these are genuine followers of Christ, or whether they're ravenous wolves who are fleecing you and who are, pardon the pun, pulling the wool over your eyes. And again, such a simple and obvious explanation. We keep reading in 16. You will recognise them by their fruits, that which they produce, that which comes forth. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Now, I have no doubt that there would have been farmers or agriculturalists of some stripe or variety present when Jesus is saying these words. And that would have been the simplest question that possibly could have asked. If there were any mathematicians present, he might as well have asked them, what is 1 plus 1? Because even the most uneducated peasant in that time understood the fact that no, grapes are not gathered from bushes with thorns on them, nor are figs from thistles, which is essentially the same but different. So if I see that there's thorns on these bushes, can I logically conclude that this is a grape tree, that I'm in the middle of a winery? Negative. No. Because if it has thorns, it won't be a grape tree. Now, I'll use an analogy which will seem ridiculous, but it's intentionally crafted that way to try and prove the very same point that's being proved here. Suppose that I came in half an hour after I was scheduled to come up here, and we're all sitting around, right, which would be invited, we'll just get someone else who's better. But if you were all sitting around for whatever reason, waiting for Daniel to turn up, and I come in, right, looking totally normal, nothing's wrong, dressed the same way I am now, everything seems all good. And Pastor Steve asks the normal question, where the heck were you? What are you doing? Do you not respect the opportunity you're being given? And I come in saying, I'm sorry, Pastor, I was coming over here, driving here on the way over, and I had a flat tyre, so I had to change the tyre, and one of the lug nuts fell out, rolled on the road, and I just wasn't thinking. So when I ran out of the road to pick it up, I looked up and realised that there was a Mack truck coming right for me, and it was simply too late to get out of the way, Pastor, and I just got run over by the truck. You would all react the way you just did, and hopefully commit me to psychological care. Because the concept that I just got run over by an 18-wheeler would be ridiculous. I'm standing here perfectly fine. Nothing's wrong, not dishevelled, not crushed, not broken in a million pieces. And so you would say, well, you're lying, or you're either lying or you're insane. I say, no, I got run over by an 18-wheeler, I don't know what you want to do. And you would say, no, you're lying to us, or you're trying to deceive us. Well, if that be the case, then why do we think that people who have the outward displays of unrighteousness, of unholiness, of all these various things which don't conform to what we're told a Christian looks like, why would we believe them? If they do not produce the fruits of the Christian tree, to use that analogy, you can logically conclude that they're not Christian, that something's wrong here, that at the bare minimum, they're not telling you the truth. There's of course the old adage that you can't judge a book by its cover, except for the part where you can. Because when I go to my library and I look and I see any writing, I see Plato's Republic, well, what I know is that that book isn't a Dickens novel. When I walk in and see a history book saying the history of the War of 1812, I now know that that's not Narnia. You can judge a book by its cover. Now, you don't know the full story on the inside, but you can judge a book by its cover, and it's a ridiculous thing to insinuate. I get what the analogy is trying to say, except when you dig that deeper philosophically, you can judge a book by its cover. You can tell whether it's a history book or a fiction novel. I can see who the author is, I can see what the title is, I can tell you the cover is a navy blue, whatever. So too can you tell by people's fruits, by what they produce. That may be hidden to a degree, but it is there. That's why it's so scandalous when people, pastors of some variety, or preachers or teachers or leaders or whatever the deal is, are exposed to have been doing things for decades and no one knew. Well, it was there, just well deceived, because again they're wolves in sheep's clothing. But those who are astute, those who are switched on, those who are discerning, and who know what a sheep looks like, will be able to tell when a wolf is pretending to be a sheep. And so when combined with what we read in verses 13 through 15 about the narrow way as juxtaposed to the wide way, we can begin to see the importance of not just the Christian living, but of course also those who lead us along that way. Those earthly leaders who lead us in that way, whether they be leaders in this church or whether they be leaders in other churches, whether they be pastors, they be teachers. And like anything, the internet is a tool that can be used well for great things, and has been. It can also be used disastrously. The access to information that we have simply at our fingertips is unlike that which any Christian has ever had before, and that provides incredible blessing. I grew up 18 years in a church, and it was a YouTube sermon that saved me. Praise God. But when we open ourselves to that kind of level and scope, we also open ourselves to that level and scope of danger and of these ravenous wolves who have a platform that is orders of magnitude greater, wider and higher than any false prophets or false teachers throughout history. A false prophet in this day may have his teaching spread around a city or even a town, perhaps even the province, all of Nazareth perhaps, heck, even all of the province of Judea. But a wolf today can have his false teachings spread across the 7 continents and spread all around the world to hundreds of millions of people. You will know them by their fruits. Be they these ravenous wolves that are in sheep's clothing you are fleecing and deceiving people, or be they other people around you. And it doesn't need to turn into a witch hunt, because you will be able to tell by their fruit. The fruit is there. You just have to know what you're looking for. As I said earlier, in order to know what a crooked line is, you must first know what a straight line is. And we're given that all throughout the scriptures, what that straight line is. It is arguably more important now than perhaps ever in your lives to be on guard and discerning, to make sure that what you believe is true, that it is well thought through, that it is rational, that it is logical, granted to you by God. That whilst we may fall and slip and stumble upon this way, nevertheless, we can have confidence that the great shepherd, to continue that motif, will be there guiding us, protecting us, and carrying us tooth and nail along the way. That the implications of the fact that this way is narrow and difficult and arduous should spur us on to the reality of the fact that the Christian life should be difficult, arduous, and full of struggle. For life is struggle. It is a struggle physically. It is a struggle in the mind. It is a struggle in the soul. The imagery of warfare that's used so often in the New Testament is not a mistake. The concept of putting on the armour of God, say in the latter parts of Ephesians, is given there for a reason. Because there's a fight. There's a fight for your mind. There's a fight for your soul. There's a fight for who controls you. And that extends not just to these ethereal spiritual concepts, but rather those spiritual concepts acting out in the world. There is no shortage of people who vie for your soul, who vie for control of who you are and who you worship and what you do. Those forces are ultimately the forces of darkness and of evil, but they operate in a physical and tangible world. And we must be prepared, because that narrow way marches straight through the battlefield. And we are called to put on the armour of God, which includes both defensive and offensive weapons, to be able to fight, not for ourselves, not for our glory, not for our honour, not for our integrity, but rather to fight for God's kingdom, to fight for what is true, to fight for what's right, what is just, what is compassionate, what is loving. Whether we be here or northern Nigeria or China or Iran, the call is the same. That we're called to be brave and courageous, or to use the parlance in Joshua, to be strong and courageous, to be like Daniel and the boys in Babylon, to not simply go with the quite literally millions of people that would have been gathered at that idol, but rather to stand for what's right, to stand for what's true, to stand for what God commands, to honour and worship Him, and not the ways and wisdom of men. To be like the warriors of David's army who reinforced him in 1 Chronicles. They were mighty and experienced warriors, experts in shield and spear, who had faces like the faces of lions and who were as swift as gazelles upon the mountaintops. They had these faces of lions that demonstrated their bravery, their courage, their wisdom, their temperance, their patience, their honour, not in and of themselves, but in the one whom they followed. That is what this way is. It is difficult and arduous and full of struggle. But it must be that way, because the only alternative is this broad, comfy, smooth ride that will grant you ease, that won't be difficult, that you can ride for the rest of your life, but it will lead to destruction. It will lead to your end. Enter by the narrow gate. Entrust your life to God, and trust that He will carry you along that arduous, winding, steep and difficult path. Do so as people with the faces of lions, strong and courageous in the Lord, trusting not and leaning not on your own understanding and wisdom, but rather putting trust in the one who is to be trusted above all, the one who is to be feared and respected above all, the one who is the only sovereign who can truly do this for us. And be on guard, for there are many, many ravenous wolves that lurk in the dark, that wind their way in and out of the trees of the forest. And they are coming for you. The question is, are you ready for them? Are we ready for them? Are we prepared to be able to stay strong and stay true and stay right in God as citizens and ambassadors of His kingdom above all else? And remember that you will know them by their fruit if there happens to be any confusion. Be strong and courageous in the Lord.